Well, it's lovely to talk to you all today and to be here as well to talk to Úna Monaghan about this research. My name's Lynette Fay, so I'm just here to facilitate Una telling her story and telling us what she's been doing basically. And I am just really curious about this research that she has done. And I have to say, this has been my first proper opportunity to speak to Una about it. I find the subject fascinating for reasons that we'll discover between now and the end of the session. So just to recap, Una is the author of the paper 121 Stories, the Impact of Gender on Participation in Irish Traditional Music. Una is a Belfast-based musician, composer, academic and sound engineer. Even that description doesn't do her justice. And in 2021, her research paper was published in the Journal of Ethnomusicology Ireland, and it details experiences of sexism in Irish traditional music, and the study received ethical approval from Cambridge University Faculty of Music Ethics Committee as well. So we'd love you to join the discussion. Any questions, do send them in to us as we go along. And we're recording this session as well. So, you know, feel free to let friends know that it's here, it exists, and to hear the conversation as well. So without further ado, Una, welcome. Great to see you.
Thanks a lot, Lynette. And just to echo what Lynette said about questions, you know, the research paper's published now and it's freely available for everyone to read. So maybe one of the most important purposes of today is to just really tease out any questions that people have about it that aren't answered by the paper itself. So I'm happy to talk through the paper, but also it would be just great to hear what other people find most interesting about it or most unclear about it.
So, Una, let's start with the reasons why the paper exists in the first place. Why was there a need for this type of survey and this type of work?
It was a really gradual process looking back. I've been working in loads of different roles in the music industry for the last 20 odd years, it must be now. And, you know, I'd experienced lots of examples of ways in which my gender affected trying to get into the roles that I was getting into, the daily reality of doing them, and how I felt when I was doing them. But generally, just as with everything in life, you sort of get on with things, you do what you want to do, and you find the best way of doing it. There were a couple of instances which really sat with me and really affected me, and one in particular, which was really complicated to work out why it was happening, and eventually I did work out why it was happening, and I did come to the conclusion that it was gender related. But I've realised very quickly that given the freelance nature of music, given the small size of the community, given, you know, that there aren't HR departments in this job, that if I were to do anything about it, kick up a fuss, frankly, the only person who was going to suffer was me, and it probably wasn't going to have any effect. I really just looked at the situation, assessed that, and I thought, well, okay. And that sat with me. And if you have a kind of a frustration about that sort of thing, it's hard if there's no outlet for it. So I eventually ended up writing a piece about it. I had an open commission in Bulk Festival in Derry, gave me the opportunity to write a piece about anything. And so I chose that. It was called What Haven't We Heard? And it was with Pauline Scanlon, a brilliant singer. And it was really just focusing on the fact, well, if this is happening, or if there are things happening disproportionately dependent on gender, and that's stopping people participating fully, what art and what music and what song are we not hearing, and how is the art and the music that we hear poorer as a result? So that was the kind of concept behind that piece. And I thought, well, if I'm able to put my frustration into that every time we perform it, then that's an outlet. And that's where I thought I had to start and finish with that question. When we were rehearsing that, it was writing that in late 2017, early 2018. The whole fair play movement in traditional music started, and that, you know, there were other women and lots of other women in Ireland, and then, you know, it progressed and became a worldwide really movement within traditional music. And that was a lot of people working together. Throughout 2018, we put on workshops, raised awareness, we had sessions, we had concerts, we had social media campaigns, and that was a full-time thing throughout 2018. But during that time, it became very clear that there were lots of people who didn't see a problem, lots of people who hadn't experienced it, both women and men, And more than that, people were angry that it was being brought up, angry at what was being suggested. And so it became clear to me that if you tell one story, it can always be passed off as bad behavior or an unlucky incident or someone, and a misinterpretation. And I realized that we would need everyone's story at once because it's really nuanced, it's really complicated, it's often not provable, and one person's voice isn't enough. So there needed to be a way that was robust, that was a respected method, that was informed, really, of collecting these stories and writing about them and making them available. And the second thing about it was that it had to be anonymous because people were really afraid of the effect that it would have on their social music making, their career, their relationships. So I had to make a way of providing everyone with a range of stories that were anonymous.
So those are the reasons why this survey came into being in the first place, Una. And when you say that, I just keep thinking of Athlete A and the end of that very powerful documentary about gymnasts and how they were extremely badly treated. It was when the girls started speaking together as one voice that people started to listen, and it seems like the same thing has happened here.
It's
Um,
partly that it's in numbers it makes it
yeah.
stronger, but it's also that if you have many stories, you can start to draw themes. You can do a
Mhm.
thematic analysis on many people's very different stories, and you can begin to draw out themes and common characteristics of these stories that enable us to put a shape on them and enable us then to do something about them.
So how do you approach something like this? The survey, was it difficult to get people to respond or to contribute their stories? I know.
There were two things. There's about how you go about it, and there was also about, as you say, engagement. Um, the going about it. I mean, I'm a musician and a composer. It's not my area of research to be carrying out surveys and looking at how to properly analyze the results of those surveys. So I had to do a lot of work myself, learning how about thematic analysis methods, and I had support. I was working in Cambridge at the time. Um, there were people from the sociology and psychology department who use these research methods all the time, and I got so much support from researchers, friends over there, who were able to point me towards the correct methods, support me in my analysis of it. In terms of getting people to be involved, I mean, I was lucky in that the fair play movement had already started, and I think I started my survey design around about April, May of 2018, and the pilot went out in summer 2018, and then so that we had feedback on how that went, and then the main survey was open in early autumn 2018. So it was a long process of honing how I was doing the survey and getting the word out, which I did via social media mostly. Made a video, went out through Twitter and Facebook, and it was really mostly online. And that, of course, affects who sees it and who responds.
It seems to me that there was a huge element of it was a behavioral research. When you were bringing the stories together, that's what jumps out at me in a lot of psychology and sociology. So I'm not surprised to hear that you approached it in that way, and I wouldn't expect anything else from you, Una. But when you're doing something like this as well, I imagine there have to be limitations. You only put the word out there on social media. Not everyone in the world is maybe au fait or bothers with social media or is confident with it. So what were the limits, or how were you limited when you
Yeah,
undertook the research?
that's a really important question in any academic work, and everything will have its limitations. Every composition has its limitations as well. It's just really important to make clear in the write up what those limitations are. So there are things that this survey is not, and I knew that from the start. A lot of this was set down in my design of it. One of the things that I didn't set out to do was to prove that this is happening. I wasn't setting out to take a survey of all the people or a large amount of people involved in traditional music and say, is this happening, yes or no? And then try and get a percentage of that to say, see, it's happening. That would have been really hard to do because you wouldn't have been able to access everyone. You would have taken a long time to properly get a very big sample of people across all different groups of people who participate in Irish traditional music. So I knew that would be very hard to do, and also that I didn't think it would be the most useful thing to do either. Instead of finding out if it's happening, I wanted to find out what is happening and what are the contexts it's happening in. How is this thing manifesting itself in the daily lives of traditional musicians, and therefore how can we maybe take steps to fixing it. In terms of who we manage to reach, the range of the age range and I took information on people's level of participation in Irish traditional music, so they self-defined as whether they were experienced or expert, whether they performed professionally, what their age range was. Because a lot of what I was thinking at this time was, I'm doing this work because we need evidence. People who disagree are asking for evidence, and people who agree are asking for evidence so that they can work out what to do about it. So I wanted to provide that, but I'm a composer and a musician. I didn't want to spend the next 20 years of my life analysing this really rich data. So I was trying to put limits on it in the design of it so that I had quite a concise and a limited survey that would give a picture, but that wouldn't make me tempted to sit and work on it for the next 20 odd years, because I wanted to get back to making the music. And that is the real irony with this, working with people who provide their time to do this work, is that they're doing it because they're coming from wanting to actually be playing rather than doing the activist work. And I'm happy to do that to a point, but I wanted this survey and this study to be concise and to be useful.
So it's a gauge of experiences up until the point where the survey was taken. When you say that you don't want to be working on it for the next 20 years, I find that interesting, Una, given the conversation that we're going to have between now and the end of the session, because it seems to be a continuing situation for many, many reasons, and we'll get to those.
Then, but you just clarify, I mean, I'm happy to be talking about this and be working towards it for the next 20 years, but the amount of data that you take in and the richness of that data, and see, if I were to ask 10 more questions on the survey than I did ask, I would get so much information in that just simply working through it would have taken me a long time. So I limited the number of questions I asked, almost to make sure that I didn't gather, because if I gathered a lot of information, I would feel tempted really to spend time analysing it. So I kept it to one main question, and that provided so much information that it took me 3 years, and there's a lot more could be done on the answer to that one question.
What was that one question?
It was tell your story, of a time when you considered gender to be an issue in Irish traditional music. So it was really open. It really just said, tell your story of when gender was an issue. And so that invites a person to think, well, was gender an issue? And it leaves it open for people who saw it happen to someone else, for it to be an issue in a good way or a bad way. It really is an open question, and it meant that the responses were really varied.
Out of interest, from the respondents that you who were in touch with you and completed the survey, did many people comment on something they had witnessed happen to someone else, or was it mainly someone telling you about an experience that had happened to them?
It was mostly people who had experienced something happening to them. There were many more people identified as female who answered than male, but of the men who answered, they describing.
Okay, and they were calling it out.
Yeah,
that's really positive. So what do we know about those who responded to the survey? Una, point might be useful to explain maybe the context in which problems were identified. because they range from the social context to the professional world of traditional music?
Yeah. So one of the questions or the things that we were hearing during the Fair Play campaign was that this was a profession. And that's a tension within Irish tradition anyway, because there's a strong social aspect to it, and it is something that, of course, we learn and we play and we enjoy and we share without any money changing hands a lot of the time, and without it being someone's job. But at the same time, there now are many people working in this as a career, so it's important to address both aspects. But it's also important to acknowledge that traditional music happens in contexts that are necessarily professional. However, it's hard now to find really ever done this nationally, or only everyone has. So I asked people, do they play full time sometimes or never? And full time was 25%, part time 30%, 30%. So there was a good overlap there between it. These weren't all full-time musicians, professional musicians. That's only 25% of the respondents who were full-time professional. So I think that proves to me that it's not simply a professional problem. And I think some of the contexts that came out, we had sessions mentioned, we had children in learning environments mentioned. Um, some of them were professional contexts, but a lot weren't.
Well, let's get into some examples of the issues. We're going to give an overview, Una, and you mentioned the session there. I think that's a good place to start. You mentioned in your report that the session should be egalitarian and a welcoming environment, and submissions you received describe that not to be the case. And I was really taken by the comment from one person who said that an incredible amount of stamina and brass neck is needed to remain part of the scene. That doesn't sound very egalitarian or welcoming to me. What are the main, or were the main problems with the traditional music session? People walking in that pub, seeing musicians sitting in a corner, would never think that this is going on.
Yeah, and again, they're really some of the stories can be really subtle. I'm thinking of one in particular that has always stayed with me. And it was of a woman describing playing in a pub all night, and she happened to be the only woman in, I think, a group of four, and the other three were guys, and they played tunes all night, and it was great crack. At the end of the night, there were 3 or 4 older men in the bar, and they came over to thank the musicians, and that's a really normal thing that happens. You say cheers for the music all night, but they thanked and shook the hands of the 3 men, and just looked at her and turned away. Now, that's a really interesting story for me to unpack, because I can see and have sympathy for people in both contexts there, because from the point of view of the woman, she has played the same tunes and done the same thing as the men all night, but has felt completely unacknowledged, completely invisible. And what does that do to her sense of what she contributed, what her value was to the people in the bar? From the point of view of the older men, there is an argument there that their experiences of a time when bars used to be places women weren't in. We don't have to go that far back to find that they were a place where there were very few women in a bar. So it's possible that they grew up or formed their experiences at a time when it may not have been in their vocabulary to know what to say to a woman who's played in a bar all night. And it would be great if that could change. It would be great if those tools could be developed. It would be great if they could simply treat her the same way, with a handshake and a thanks for playing the tunes all night. But I can't help but feel, there may be straight sexism there. There may be straight disdain. And there may be a lot of, we can't read anything else into that story, but there may also just be simply a situation where those men didn't quite know what to say. But it doesn't stop that woman really feeling the difference between how she was treated and how the men were treated.
Just when you say that, is there a lot of pushback on your research as, well, that's one person's perception of it might not have been the intention, and how do you process or unpack that?
Yeah, that has come up verbally to me, but also interestingly in some of the responses to the survey. So the survey went out and we asked for stories of people's experiences, but there were people who responded to that survey simply to oppose the research, not given any example of when they saw gender to be an issue, but really just filled in the whole survey with the object of ridiculing the very fact that the research was being done, and in some ways quite aggressively. Um, and so there were other responses that weren't so aggressive, but that gently said, this is just one person's behavior. You're making a problem where there is no problem.
Mhm.
Um, that's why I did the research in the way that I did. I have so many stories from my own experience of traditional music since I was a child, right up until my professional experiences. And if I tell one of those stories, it is completely possible, for the most part. Some of them are really blatant, but for the vast majority of them, you can just say, what happened there wasn't illegal. What happened there could have been uh, someone's behavior. Uh, People, my friends, I have a few friends, especially who really do say, and they're right, is that people's memory of events or people's own interpretation of events is obviously affected by their experience. So my
Mhm.
interpretation of an event, which was completely harmless, is is colored by my experience, and people's memories are not always reliable. So if you take one story, yes, most of these stories are completely dismissible and are not provable to be related to gender. My issue is that there definitely is a gender issue in drag from my point of view, and if we take all of the stories together and we work the thematic analysis that I have done, and we take the themes out that have have been developed from the stories, we're looking for patterns. We're no longer looking at the specific stories. We're seeing things like, instrumentation, assumptions being made about instrumentation broadly, assumptions being made that you have to look a certain way to be accepted or to get ahead. um there are people isolating themselves again and again. That's not a specific story, but there are instances of isolation. Things come up about young people in their learning environments, being invited to play a certain instrument over the one they actually want to play, for example, or being told that in the group of they're put up front as eye candy before, they're teenagers. It's And then you get to things like sexual assault and power dynamics. Also, things like alcohol has come up in a lot of the stories, both used as a currency to pay musicians and what that does, but also in creating environments that are not safe disproportionately for women. And then you have the whole area of professional work and being blatantly underpaid or treated differently in sound checks and everything. So,
I want to get into that professional context, Una, because you mentioned at the very start it's difficult in, well, any job. If you're a freelancer, it's precarious. But particularly when you're dealing with traditional music, because it is a very, very small world, it's difficult to know whether it's the right thing to do to raise your voice, to articulate that something is not right. But your research shows that the current music industry practices exacerbate, facilitate, or perpetuate gender inequality, and you gave examples. The gender pay gap is there. Um, Women, the treatment of women because they maybe want to have families or have responsibilities, I thought was an interesting one, where they need, and it goes to the need to look a certain way. They can't be overweight. They need to look pretty. They have to wear the right clothes. Um, is this acceptable professional conduct in any job? And if if there were strict HR guidelines in the world of traditional music, how would that work out for the managers, or the or for the people who are treating women like this?
I mean, all of those issues, childcare, appearance, pay, and assumptions of who is leading a professional environment, they all came up again and again. There was one person who had taken the time to write, I think, a 3-page submission about, you know, that went from their experiences right from when they started right up through, you know, the period in their early 20s when they were playing music and going to bars, then through having children and bringing them up, and how that changed their relationship with the music, and their access to where the music was happening and their energy levels. Um, and that was just such a, I felt very grateful to that person who had submitted. I don't know who any of these people are, but that they took the time to really detail. It really just showed the, and there wasn't room in the paper to put the whole story that she'd written, but it really helped to see how it affects over the course of a lifetime. And that's really important, because you don't see someone's lifetime. You don't get the opportunity to see how everything knits together unless you do something like this. In terms of the regulations, yeah, I mean, every freelancer in other careers as well know how hard that is. You're constantly negotiating space in the moment. It's not always comfortable, appropriate, in your best interests to bring this stuff up as soon as you see it happen. It often takes days, weeks, years in my case, of reflection before you can go back to that person and say, what happened there was not okay. It wasn't okay in a professional environment. It had this effect on me. But at the end of the day, it's still really hard to go anywhere with that, even if you do that extra emotional labor, which was the top code that came out, you know, in 78 out of the 121 responses. This, the emotional labor, the extra emotional load of processing this stuff was the most common code. Even
Tell me
if
a bit more about that, Una, about the emotional labor. What do you mean by that?
I tagged a story with that code at any point where there was extra mental load because of the person's gender. So it was things like uh, they would be at a session and had to put up with someone constantly harassing them, and then decided to take themselves, well, for the duration of the session they were putting up with that. So that's an extra emotional load that the other men in that session were not having to deal with. You know, they're overcoming that before they even lift up a flute or a fiddle. That's ongoing, that's their night. Then they remove themselves from that situation and go home. And then they had, you know, we're telling the story of being at home, being isolated, being angry then that they had taken themselves out of the situation and hadn't actually done anything about it. I mean, that person's whole 4 or 5 hours of a night was taken up by different emotions at different points in it. And by the time they got home alone, they were then angry that they were home alone, not at the session anymore. Also angry that no one that they had asked to help had done anything other than make fun. And then, you know, angry that they even had to deal with it. So that's the type of emotional labor I'm talking about, where people, they've extra emotional load, mental load, yes, through no fault of their own as a result of their gender. And that, you know, that happens also professionally as well. If you are in a sound check, or you, and your opinion is not taken account of, professional musicians are on a stage and they have to go through a sound check and a gig, and there's enough adrenaline and confidence and everything else needed at that point. If you also encounter, say, for example, a sound engineer who does not believe you when you say, I want to use this microphone and I have reason to, that's extra emotional load, which is on top of what you're already doing to be on that stage in the first place. There's another person described that they were co-leading a band, and that the members of the band always took what their co-leader, who was a man, said over what they said. Now, it's hard enough to be leading a band without also dealing with feelings of confidence or questioning whether people are listening to you. There was another person who had just done a gig. She was the leader of the band. Her name was on the banner at the back of the stage. A journalist interviewed her afterwards and asked, how does it feel to be the token woman in this band? So she is trying to do an interview again, which requires a certain level of emotional and mental load. And she has to put on top of that the fact that this person doesn't even believe she is actually leading her own band. So that's what I'm talking about when I say emotional load. It's extra work simply as a result of your gender. And I've seen from the stories that over the course of a lifetime, some people can take that extra emotional load on, and some people stop and put that load down. and remove themselves either from the situations in music or from music altogether. And that's not my speculation. That was said in the stories. I took myself out of it. You said, that example you gave of the session. It became too hard for me to participate. These are not me drawing information from the stories. These words are written.
So, the option there was to leave the situation, walk away, remove yourself from this world. And a big part of the reason is the complex gender bias in society. The gender bias is why that journalist asked the woman why she was the token in the band. Um, there's just this normalization of sexism, Una. So you had 50 responses of incidents that happened in public. And I'm interested by these because this is this culture of permission, normalization, and sexism in society. And it's not confined to interaction between adults. I think you've already touched on this, where the teenager was told from an early age, you're the eye candy, that's why you're here, or you're going to play this particular instrument. But this seems to me to be a massive part of your research, is this normalization, that it's kind of accepted, that people don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to call out behaviors when they see them happening either to themselves or to others. Una, what was the overriding experience from your research on this particular point?
Um, the sexism in society, it's really important to say that that was a huge part of the codes and the tags and the themes that came out as well. And this was one of the reasons why I did the research as well, is that one of the, I guess, the disagreements that were leveled at these discussions before the research was published was that this is a societal problem. It's not traditional music specific. Now, that is true. It is something that happens in society, manifesting itself in traditional music. So, to an extent, it is something that happens everywhere. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to address it in traditional music for a start. But I would, after having done the research, I have a section in the paper about, yes, it happens in society, but there are mechanisms and structures in Irish traditional music which allow this to happen and in some cases exacerbate it. So there are things about traditional music that we can change and improve, specific to traditional music, not just a societal thing. So it is really important not just to throw our hands up and say it happens everywhere in society, therefore we sit back. About the normalization, that was something that I became really curious about. And again, with the thematic analysis, you go through it and you go through it several times to make sure that there aren't other codes coming out as you read down the 121. You might arrive at number 80 and say, there's something in there which makes you think of a pattern or a tag. And you then say, does that happen in any of the others actually? And you go back and you read again. So I have read through these. I've lost count of the amount of times to make sure that I've taken out all as I see it and as I can, all of the patterns. The normalization one was where I noticed something being said, and I thought that's being said in a public place, in a bar. So there are a few things there. There's when the person, say, for example, the woman is experiencing this derogatory comment. There's emotional load there. She has to process that, and that has an effect on her. But I wondered to think about it from the point of view of the person delivering that comment. That person has no expectation that they're going to be challenged, either from the person they're saying it to or from anyone else in the public company. And that made me interested because I thought, well, there's got to be an element of it. It's appropriate for them to say that. They believe it's appropriate for them to say that, or they believe they'll get away with it, or they'll believe that no one will challenge them. And so I thought it was really important to say, should we not be aware of the normalization of this? And is that not something we can all be involved in? If it's okay to say this sort of thing in pub, it's one thing when you have the story and it's between two people and privately. But if the story setting is described as being in a public place or in a sound check or places where there are other people to hear, is it not the case that they feel empowered to say this? And what is empowering them to say that? The culture and the permissiveness, really, of everyone else too.
It's interesting, Una, that you're having this discussion today. I was working in a professional environment yesterday, and in context what you said about this is societal, this is a societal problem. It's not the job of the traditional music world to deal with it. What can we do? Throw the shoulders up and away we go. I was in a position yesterday where very uncomfortable comments were made to me 3 times in a professional environment, and I squirmed. Before, in the professional environment, had that happened, I would have possibly laughed it off, ha 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 ha, in a very uncomfortable way, really inherently unhappy in the inside that this had happened, but I didn't stand up to it. Equally, yesterday, I was in a room full of men and I didn't stand up to what had been said because I didn't know how to. I was so shocked that this had just happened, not once, but twice, but 3 times. So, am I adding to the problem by not acting upon that yesterday, by feeling so angry? I went home last night. I did feel the emotional load. I processed it. I spoke about it when I went home. I spoke about it again this morning. I've made a decision on how I'm going to move forward, but I didn't do it in the moment. And that experience has to be the norm for so many people when someone says something inappropriate to them. Where do you stand on that? Because I felt like a hypocrite, I know, to be honest with you, and especially coming into this conversation today.
There's a few things just jump out at me there after having done this work. There are the comments that the person made to you,
Mm-hmm.
but after having done all this work, what really screams to me as being the most important is, as you said yourself, the emotional load. There's the example of it. That has sat with you throughout when you were trying to do your job yesterday. It impinged for the rest of the evening. Today we're talking about it. Then how you've decided to resolve that, however that is, that takes your time. No one is paying you for that. And it is affecting how you have viewed that experience, how you view your next experience. It is an effect, a tangible effect on you. The other thing you said was that has got to be the norm across lots of different, situations. That's a really natural thing to say, and that's what I was saying in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
But you're called on that all the time. People say, do not extrapolate. Just because you've experienced that doesn't mean others are. There exactly is the reason why we needed several of these stories, 121 in this case. But if I continued to collect, there would have been many more, and then it would have taken me much more time to analyze them. So it's the fact that we can't just say this has happened to me and therefore it happens. You have to actually produce this evidence before people will really listen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then about the person, about the hypocrite story, everyone has limited resources. We see that in the people who have removed themselves, isolated themselves from the scene. Each human has a limited amount of resources to deal with this. It depends on your gig or my gig whether or not I have the resources in the moment to deal with that. And in some gigs, my mental resources or my creative resources are at the limit because of the action of what we're doing. If it's live TV or if it's a
Demands, yeah.
big, yeah, you cannot do that. And I have learned over time to respect the limits on my resources, be that in the moment or be that for the next 5 years. And we can talk about resources in terms of this work as well. I have seen my resources deplete over the course of this work. So it is mirrored in a very immediate sense in terms of the hypocrisy of not speaking out. It's not on us, nor are we even able to immediately change that person's behavior, the words they use. We cannot change the scene in one moment. Our work will suffer maybe if we try to do that. It's actually more important that you manage to do your job, that I manage to play the music. Maybe it's not a job, to enjoy the session. It's more important that we honor and have the opportunity to have that experience than we have to spend this time and energy that no one is paying us for to do that. So there's that. I really think the hypocrisy thing, you do what you can do. And at the point where it starts to become all you do, where you are robbed of your enjoyment of the music or your ability to work professionally in it as you've trained and worked towards, that's the point at which I say, no, I'm not giving anymore today. I'm honoring my work and my enjoyment. Um, this work in and of itself, I know that I had more energy to do it and more will to do it at the start of 2018 than I do now. Because throughout this paper took me 3 years to research and write. How many compositions did I not do during that time? That's one way of looking at it, because we cannot make more time. I know that I would have played more music, done more practice, written more pieces if I wasn't doing this work. That's a loss to me that I live with. It's not insignificant. Um, as well as that, the emotional toll it takes on me to read through 100 people's experiences of pain. Um, it is the case that my partner eventually, after a while, began to know when I was working on this project. I would come downstairs from my desk, and the demeanor and the tension, and he would immediately say, "You've been working on that again, haven't you?" He would know. So, and that, I mean, that's just me reading through them. The people who have experienced this stuff, hidden, people are showing up at gigs to work with people who have abused them. Um, these are ongoing issues for people, and we don't always see the toll.
So, Una, let's talk about the response then from the community. You're saying about reading through the submissions and the emotional toll it took on you. I found it very emotional reading through some of the submissions that this had really happened to people. Yeah, and as you say, yet they found themselves working with these people time and time again and bringing themselves into a situation that's bound to be causing them a lot of stress time and time again because they've no choice in the matter. What has the response from the community been like when you were doing the study and after the publication? Was there a difference in tone from during the research to publication, when it was there in black and white and people could read these experiences for themselves?
I think it's important as they have noticed a difference. When everybody started talking about this in early 2018, it was a surprise to many people. It was inappropriate to bring up. There was talk of disrespect of the tradition. It was felt to be um, an upset, an unnecessary upset. And it's not the first time it happened. There was work done by Macalla and raising awareness of this by different people throughout history. But this was another step really in that direction with fair play. So uh, there was a very strong response at the start, and it has got better, and it has got better with the more and more work people have done, the more stories people have shared, and yes, the ability of this now to be in black and white in a rigorous academic study. So things are improving, and now that we have evidence, if you like, to point to, it is easier. It's getting easier to be listened to. In terms of the response itself, I've had everything from personal emails denouncing me, my work, my career. I've had some, I had an email advising me not to publish the work um, from someone in academia, which is strange, and it did sort of put a warning light in my head as well. People are trying to prevent you from sharing this stuff. That to me is an indicator that it is important. Um, I had the responses that came in through the survey, which are detailed in the paper, some of which were very angry. And then when it was published, I had a great response really from the media. It was covered by the BBC on their news bulletin online and also on their TV news. And that was done very sensitively, which I was grateful for. There were radio interviews in the South as well with RTE. So that was all really positive, and one in particular organised a panel discussion with representatives from some of the Irish traditional music institutions. The social media response from members of the community, musicians and people involved, has been really positive, but also some really difficult to take negative threads. One in particular I'm thinking about on Facebook. And I felt, as you did, a dúilgeas in English, like a responsibility to respond to that, because while some people were coming out very angrily in opposition, there are other people reading that who genuinely want those questions answered as well. And I felt the need to try and respond as best I could. So, I lost sleep over that. Literally, was up in the middle of the night trying to reply, trying to make sure that my responses were really detailed, really watertight, And I mean, that was a lot of work suddenly, because the way social media works is you either engage at the time or you don't engage. And I didn't want it just to be radio silence. So that took a lot more time. And I don't know how useful it was. A lot of the vitriolic comments were deleted soon after about a week, but there was a lot of action on it. Um,
But this was all on social media. It was, a personal possible knee jerk if it was reactionary in that way and then deleted afterwards. But I wonder, Una, about the organizations and institutions that do exist within traditional music. How or have they, I know that they're not directly addressed perhaps within your research, but have any of them outwardly responded to this research in any way?
the public response from the Irish traditional music institutions has been almost total silence, and that is disappointing. There are some in particular mentioned that come up in the stories, but even those that aren't particularly mentioned, I think with work of this breadth and nuance and that covers the number of contexts in traditional music that it covers, there is a responsibility, and it is in the interest of every traditional music institution, organization, summer school, festival, to read it and to work out how it affects them, how they can contribute, whether it matters, and to make some sort of response. There are two things I would say. One is that I'm on the board of the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Dublin, and they have always been very open to supporting this work. We are working at the moment on providing all of the stories in their entirety available in the archive for people to read, which is separate from the analysis in this paper. So ITMA have also taken on board the findings of the study and have started their own internal review of gender and other representation of minority groups in traditional music. So there is a process ongoing internally in ITMA there to address representation in their collections and what their response should be to um, this paper, which is great. I also received one other message personally on social media from a traditional music school that said, we've seen this and we want to know how best we can respond. And that was completely off their own bat, that traditional music school. I thought that was brilliant. I responded to say I was really happy to meet with their committee and to talk about how this might affect them. I haven't heard anything back, but I mean, there are issues just in terms of the pandemic. Things are a bit curtailed at the moment. But for the most part, I've been disappointed because
And what would you like to see?
I would like to see, at best, a public statement from all of the major traditional music organisations, festivals, summer schools, anyone who really is responsible for engaging with the music in a big way, and especially those that are involved with children, because we know now that this begins very early. And I would like to see them, acknowledge it, um, and at best then say how they think it affects them and what they're going to do going forward to change it. Because silence, as we know, on anything, it can be really damaging. And one of the issues with this work is simply being believed, to believe it's happening, and traditional music institutions and organizations that are often publicly funded coming out and saying, we see this, we believe it, we are going to help, can be so valuable. And this is not obviously for me, it's for everyone involved in traditional music, including the children who are learning now.
And you've dealt with traditional music and this problem within this world because it is your world, Una. Do you see that the problems are evident elsewhere?
Yeah, it's hugely important to say that this work is not suggesting that the traditional music world is any worse in terms of sexism or gender relations than any other. We have seen this across all genres of music, all areas of the arts, all areas of society. And I mean, there are things like the PRS key change in the UK. Um, we've seen it in comedy. I know that the Irish Theatre Institute are carrying out research at the minute there were big movements sounding the feminists, waking the feminists in the South as well. So it's important to say that this is not a problem the traditional music world has in and of itself. I'm simply doing that work in the area where I have the expertise. So, it's important that we address it in the ways that we can in traditional music, but it's happening everywhere and it's just no different.
And finally, I think to wrap up this session today, which has been really insightful, interesting, useful. I want to end it in positivity, about solutions and how we go forward, ways that we can help people maybe who are going through something, have experienced something, don't know how to deal with it, ways we can help. And that goes for anyone who's on the call today or anybody who watches this after the event. Una, how can you take this research forward to change attitudes, to change that everyday sexism, which seems to be ingrained in society?
I think there's four things. The first is to believe it's happening. Just because it doesn't happen to you or you haven't seen it, doesn't mean it's not a problem. And that came up in the research. Many women are shielded from experiencing this for lots of reasons. Could be because they have family connections, or there may be reasons why this doesn't affect you. But I think it's important to believe it happens. The second thing is that it's really nuanced and complicated, and that means that it's hard to address, but it also means that everyone is able to in their own small way. So to speak about it and to address it in your own sphere. The third thing I would say is, if you're able to call it out, if you have the resources in that time and if you feel you have the support, actively speak out in support when you see something like this happen or you hear something